Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us virtually on this Zoom broadcast today. We have a few people in the room, so we're going to get started. If someone else is coming in, they'll be able to catch up. I'm Graham Braun. I'm the roaster and co-owner at Monogram Coffee Roasters. We're in Cambridge, Ontario. It's about 45 minutes west of Toronto in the middle of Canada. It's currently a cold day here. I'm going to switch you over to a view of the agenda. I'll talk a little bit more about our background and why I think I'm the one you want to listen to talking about this. Here's the agenda for today. I'm going to jump into some stuff on, very briefly, cupping for selection. We're going to spend most of our time on optimizing samples and how we move those into production. Part 3 is sort of some shortcuts and some tips and tricks that I think I can lend you about getting faster with sample roasting and optimizing for production roast. And in the last part, we'll do a little Q&A, and with the coffees that we're talking about in the samples phase, I'll pour myself a coffee, drink it while we talk to each other in a little Q&A way. I'll leave that agenda up for a minute. Monogram Coffee is named for Monica and Graham. Monica is my wife. I'm the Graham part. We started roasting coffee in 2012, and we've been able to successfully do what I would call a third wave style of roastery in a smaller town in Ontario, Canada, and we're still doing it 8 years later. Our espresso has been written up as one of the top espressos in Ontario. We have coffee going coast to coast in Canada, some a little bit overseas for deliveries. We're really proud of the coffee we roast, and we've come a long way over 8 years in terms of developing some of our protocols around how we select our coffees and how we dial in roasts that we think are going to be things we can be proud of. That said, let's get started. Have we got a few more joined?
14.
Excellent. That's a nice size. With the number of people we have on, which is not a huge list, we're going to leave the chat window open. If you have questions as we go, I think we've got enough time today to try and address them right in stream, although there'll be a little Q&A at the end. If you have a question specific to something you can't see or can't read, can't hear, need me to repeat, or you have a question about something related to the topic I'm on at any one point, please jump in on the chat window, and we'll try and answer questions and keep an open discussion happening. So from the agenda, part 1, cupping for selection. I want to touch on this. The goal with choosing coffees is to try and find something that's going to work for you, for your customers, whether they're wholesale or retail or being served in your shop. That's an important step. And if you're bringing in 10 or 20 or 50 coffees, you want to effectively sample roast those so you can evaluate where they might fit in which niche of your shop or your business. What I recommend typically with the sample roast is that when you're cupping for evaluation, you roast all the coffees the same way. What we want to be able to do is quickly move through those 40 cups, start to deselect a bunch of them because they don't suit either the flavor profile you're looking for, move some to the front of the table because they're in the range of things that excite you, and then you can fine-tune the whole thing and spend it before the coffee gets cold in those cups, have chosen a few candidates that you might take further. I've got some issues with typical cupping forms. If you're third wave roasters like we are, you're generally bringing in some pretty high quality coffees. You don't need the sections of the cupping form that are going to talk to defects typically. If you see a defect on the cupping table when you're evaluating for candidates, you're just going to eliminate them right away anyway. You're probably not even going to score them. So you may want to come up with something that better suits the exercise that you're undertaking to evaluate coffees. For example, if you've got a hole on your shelf where you need to put a new natural Ethiopian, you're looking for some very specific flavor profiles, and maybe just knowing what you're looking for and documenting what's true about the coffees in front of you for that purpose is good. That said, if you're evaluating a wider range of coffees and you're trying to get something that's going to be happy for the cream and sugar crowd, let's keep our focus there. If you've got 10 natural Ethiopians on the table at the same time that you need to get a crowd pleaser going, You don't want to spend a lot of time saying this is the best 3 of those 10 Ethiopians, when what you needed to do is what is the best 1 or 2 of these Central American coffees. So think about your own adjusted cupping form. I don't want to spend a lot more time on evaluation of coffees and sample roasting. This was intended to be more of an examination of, once we have those samples selected, how are we going to optimize the way we're roasting it on our sample roaster, and how can we translate that to a production roaster? So that said, I'm going to jump into part 2, optimizing on samples, moving things into production. The goal here is to find the ultimate flavor for the coffee that you've chosen, in terms of how you're going to express what's true about that coffee to what comes out in the cup. That's not a trivial process. I think most of us as roasters can relate to the concept that once we have a production roast going, we're always seeing little tweaks that we can perform, and we're reevaluating the roasts that come out of the production roaster. Sometimes that's accidental, and sometimes happy accidents happen. A development time runs a little long. You get to a development time at a slightly lower or slightly higher temperature. You're going to evaluate those, and if one of those turns out to be better or worse, it could inform the way you intentionally tweak a roast going forward. That said, once you've got that coffee ready for production, or just prior to its first roast in production, you may want to explore a bunch of ranges of roasting styles that will allow you to figure out what you're going to do in the production roaster 50 grams or 100 grams at a time, instead of putting in 15 pounds or 25 pounds in your production roaster and finding out that it didn't do what you really wanted. So, sample roasting. The one that we use here is this beautiful little Ikawa roaster. I'm a big fan of the Ikawa in terms of reproducibility, ease of use, the fact that it's easy to switch profiles, to tweak profiles, try different things. So when I show some graphs and talk about how we do some calculations later, it's specific to that one. There are a lot of great other roasters out there. Very intrigued by the Roast out in Norway. I have not used that roaster yet. Some people are still back on a Bmore. I started on a Huki, doing 400 grams at a time, trying to dial in production roasts because it at least had the drum and airflow and gas controls that were typical of a drum roaster. That said, what comes out of one of these sample roasters is very different in terms of time and speed than what comes out of a production roaster. So we have to figure out what kind of sample roast we want to start with. There are a few techniques. I want to talk about 3 possible scenarios for dialing in a sample roast that would be translatable to a production roast. There's 3 of them. I'm going to call them 0, 1, and 2. The 0th roast on a sample roaster is probably taking something like this with 50 grams, one of these little sample roasters, and trying to equally roast for time and temperature what you would be doing in a production roaster. With an Ikawa, I suspect with a roast, certainly with any smaller batch sample roaster, a 4-barrel ProBat would be the same. You're not going to want to say that I have typically an 11-minute roast in my production roaster, and as a result, I'm going to set up a profile for my sample roast that's 11 minutes, and that I want to get to first crack somewhere in the first 80% of that roast, maybe dry end after 6 minutes. If you do that on an Ikawa, you're not going to have a good tasting cup. You're going to have roasted coffee, but it's not going to be something you're terribly pleased with, probably, and it's not going to inform the way you probably want to roast that coffee in a production roaster when a bunch of the physics are different. So that 0th one, I'm going to discount right away. If you have questions about what we've seen happen with that, what I've heard other people say about that, jump into the chat. Next up is the number 1th. The first thing that we see out there is an equivalence based on time within the roast. So we can talk about time-based approach, where perhaps the turnaround happens a minute and a half into the roast. We achieve a dry end 3 minutes into a roast. I'm talking about a production roast. We get to a first crack scenario after Maillard somewhere around 9.5, 10 minutes, and then we're into a development phase. We can think about those times in terms of their percentage of the total roast. You often hear DTR. We want a development time ratio where the development is spending between 16 and 20%, maybe 21% for espresso of the total roast. So a 10-minute roast would see as much as 2 minutes in the development phase after first crack. To do that, to take that time-based compression to what's going to be a faster roast in a sample roaster is one approach that we started with. So if we've got a 6-minute roast in our Ikawa and a 10-minute roast on our Diedrich, then we just look at the time percentage. If the develop or dry end was happening at 3 minutes out of a 10-minute roast, it's 30% of the time of the roast to get to dry end. And if we've saved 15 or 20% at the end for development, then we know what the centerpiece is in terms of a percentage of roast for Maillard. And we can develop a profile that at least is always doing an increase in temperature, a decreasing rate of rise on the sample roaster, where we hit those phases at the same amount of time during the roast. I want to show you some data that we did comparing our Diedrich to the Ikawa. I'm going to throw this in where the agenda was, right about there. I think I have a slide. It's going to be a little bit hard to see here. I'll keep talking over top of it. We're talking about a time comparison here when we did what we thought was equivalent tasting coffee. So I'm going to come back at this backwards, but we had a production roast of a Honduras Natural. That's the one I'll pour over at the end. And we came back to the Ikawa to establish a roast profile that would taste the same. And what we found when we compared the curves on those is that we spent equivalent, similar amounts of time in each of the phases. So bear with me, Maillard is calculated because it's not marked as a time. It's central to the entire roast. We've got a 6-minute roast on the Ikawa, an 11-minute roast on the Diedrich. We have fairly equivalent development time, 17 versus 19%. We have the first crack starting at 81 versus 83% of the time through the roast. But the real big difference here, and I know turnaround and dry end is a little bit of a subjective and thermocouple-driven process, but we have a surprisingly different amount of time spent in the Maillard phase after dry end is established and we get up to first crack. And I don't think that I could predictably take those times and translate it into another coffee. I think there must be a better way to do it. Keep it. I'll get you to go back to the overhead. I just want to show the curves on those coffees. Then we'll talk about an alternate way of doing this. That's the Ikawa on top, and that's my Diedrich roast below. Looking good. Couple things to note here. I've put them onto a nice full time scale. I actually stretched out what we're getting off a Kropster artisan style chart versus what the Ikawa data is. And when you start to do this, you're going to be as frustrated as we were earlier. Ikawa was putting out decimal time seconds that go up through the roast, whereas just about any other software will give you different time signatures up through the roast. So you're going to have to sort of regularize your data to get to comparing apples to apples within one sheet, like our little chart of time there. That said, we've got very similar typical rate of rise and bean temperature profiles here. I will draw your attention, though. This is happening at 6:30. This guy's happening way out at 11.25 minutes. They're very different roasts, although they have very similar patterns to them. And this is the exact set of equivalent roasts for us when we found we were replicating in the sampler roaster what we were getting in the Diedrich. So I started to think to myself, there must be something different we can be looking at than a time-based comparison. And that's where I'm going to throw another slide up here that's going to be hard to read. This is the area under the curve. And just to be pedantic about area under the curve, where we'll go back to the overhead, where this is our rate of rise curve, and this is the temperature of the beans. The rate of rise is the integral of, or the slope of, at any one time, the temperature of the beans. What we're going to be doing is calculating the area under the curve. Some of the roasting software will do that for you and even display it for you and do it by phase. The area under the curve is essentially another integral of the bean temperature, but it's telling you how much power went into the roast. I'll put it back up on the main camera. I wanted to shout out to the Ikawa blog. If you go on the Ikawa blog on the professional section, you'll see a post from Wolfram Sorg at Backyard Coffee. He was looking at how he could equivalate samples to production roast from an Ikawa to a larger Gießen roaster. And he started to talk about developing a matrix of input power levels, if you will, the thermal transfer that went into the coffee at any one time. In the blog post, he's showing a 9-way matrix that says, at these times, I'm going to try, during the early phase, this kind of power input, 3 different ways of the amount of power going in. And then in the second phase, 3 different amounts. And in the third phase, 3 different amounts. He also talks about in the blog that when he does this for real in Backyard Coffee, he's got a 5x5 matrix, 25 different possible sample roasts where you're varying the amount of energy that you're putting into the roast during different phases. I think there's a little bit of a drawback on that if we're trying to use a sample roaster to evaluate what we're going to do in the production roaster. You could have up to 25 samples you've got to evaluate. Yes, you can do it quickly, but we know that some of them are going to be outside the curve in terms of what you want to do. So we started looking at just using power where we could measure it. And here's where I'll go back to this slide, overhead camera, with these 2 curves that I was showing you. Where is it? Oh, I have them both here. Anyway, area under the curve as being a power that's being transmitted at any one time, second over second or in your time interval, allows you to determine by phase how much of the total energy in terms of rate of rise of the coffee has gone into the process. When we did that, we ended up with some data on area under the curve comparisons. Here's where I'll probably get you back onto a slide so you can see these numbers I'm pointing at, the area under a curve. When we had similar tasting coffee, almost identical tasting coffee out of production and sample roasts, a beautiful thing happens with the data. From our turn to the dry end, from the point that we're able to really do any meaningful measurement, we've got fairly similar numbers. From the dry end to the first crack, the amount of energy that went into that coffee, 33 versus 34%, very, very similar. And maybe the most important thing here, the amount of energy that was applied to the coffee as a percentage of total energy of the roast in the development phase was pretty spot on. I've hidden some decimals there. We're about 0.1, 0.2, depending on which set of data we compare, different, but really a lot more similar than what the time-based assessment would have told us. Different things are happening in the rate of rise. Production roast gives you different amount of control. I think that area under the curve is a wonderful way of comparing those things. Let's come back up to the main. So now you've got the ability to replicate something for what you could be doing in production, or it gives you a start point for what you'll start with in the sample roaster. Now you've got the ability to plot that data, to vary those phases, if you will. So you could very easily isolate by drawing a new profile that you're going to follow on your Ikawa to put an additional amount of the energy input during the Maillard phase to make that happen faster. It refers back to time, but if we get more energy into that phase, we know we're going to put, for the same drop temperature, less energy into the end. So it allows you to isolate variables and try some potentially wingnut ideas, where you stretch Maillard, drop at a lighter temperature with an even longer development phase. I'm suggesting that based on the way you taste your first one, which was on your typical starting sample roast, or perhaps one based on a similar coffee you've done recently, you start there and then push out in a couple of interesting isolated ways. You're going to be able to determine whether you like that more. And then you're starting to play a game of in-betweens. So if you push it out in some interesting long-distance ways and you like it better, you could always push a little more. If it gets worse, take it halfway between where it was wonderful and where it started. And maybe it's better than where it was wonderful, and it's the new wonderful. So you can probably dial into a very close, optimal coffee somewhere in the 5 or 6 sample batches just by splitting differences on changing a couple of the variables in the total energy you're putting in, area under the curve type stuff. That said, there may be untranslatable differences. If you push your sample roaster to do really interesting things, they may be things that you cannot replicate within your production roaster. So in the case of an Ikawa, definitely the Huki, even a Bmore or a roast, you can make faster turns. You can change the rate of rise more rapidly than you probably can in your production roaster. So if you went out to the extremes on your sample roaster with something about rate of rise changes that you can't reproduce in your production roaster, you got to be cognizant of that and try and avoid it. There are probably some other things. There's probably a slight taste difference because of conduction versus convection. So when you start pushing from shorter roasts to much longer roasts, you're probably going to start seeing some differences. I would probably only ever want to see sample to production roast be somewhere in the 2 to 1 times ratio. I think that a 3-minute sample roast into a 12-minute production roast is going to be harder to make taste the same or to calibrate between the two. I think it's got to be in that 2 to 1 or a little bit under range. The other side of it is probably your production roaster and actually living with life of having to produce a bunch of coffee for customers. You may create a sample that says, if I do this at 50% capacity in my production roaster, or maybe 80% or whatever you're comfortable with for small batches, you can replicate it, but it's possible that you're going to get into a situation where you're going to have to do 4 batches instead of 2 batches to replicate that profile, and that may not be a compromise you're willing to make from a total efficiency standpoint. So you want to keep your sample ultimate tasting within something that you can achieve during production batch sizes for whatever you're willing to do in terms of efficiency on the production side. Tight timelines can also push this out. If you're anything like us, sometimes you start running out of a coffee because it got popular faster than you expected. You've got new samples coming in. You want to get it on the shelf. And that's the most common, important reason to want to get your sample roast dialing in for an optimal flavor in as few roasts as possible, in as quick an evaluation as you can. I think it can be critical to business to get those samples tasting the right way quickly enough that you get the real stuff on the shelf. There's also a cost to the amount of samples you're doing, the time it takes. Although this is a nice automated process, you've got to have the right evaluations in place. I'm going to touch a little bit on sample roasting for production in terms of end use and what we end up doing with what we do in our sample roaster. Quite often we take 100 grams of coffee and we roast 1 batch of it, 50 grams in the Ikawa, and we're doing an evaluation of it usually on the cupping table, but then we'll probably use that coffee again in wherever its destination is going to be, whether it's a filter coffee, whether we intend it for espresso, that sort of thing. That leaves me with a little bit more coffee from a 100-gram sample to play even at the evaluation stage with profiles that I know work for similar coffees in that similar purpose. You want to be able to take that 100 grams and pull some espresso shots if that's what you're buying coffee for. And that can be pretty challenging if you haven't already got some samples that are sample roast profiles that are calibrated to things you tend to do for espresso. And it's another good example. Espresso is probably one of your production batches that you're never willing to compromise in getting as much coffee into the roaster as you're comfortable with at any time. We face it all the time. You can always take sample roasts and push them out, and once your coffee arrives, start experimenting with whether you're going to do a pour over or a filter coffee with those production batches, and further optimize for it. But again, you're going to be constrained by what you're doing in that production roast. I think I'm running fairly on time. Now I want to talk about what was part 3 on my little agenda. I don't know if I left my agenda up here. It's tips and tricks. It's things that we've found help speed up all of this because of the pressures and time to market, requesting samples that get caught at a border, working to find the right replacements for the right coffees. Maybe the toughest of all, developing a new espresso because you're seasonally following things and you need to evaluate a ton of coffees because you want your signature espresso to be the same. That's always one of the most challenging for us. So what I often end up doing, and I suspect a lot of us do it as well, before we had sample roasters, when I got hold of a new Kenya, I said, well, I've been roasting Kenya for years. Here is approximately what was the average of my favorite profiles on my production roaster. When I get a hold of this new Kenya, I'm going to roast it based on that average of what good Kenyas tasted like. That's not a bad thing. You're probably going to do a good job and produce a Kenya that you're proud of. But if you have a sample roaster that's calibrated back from how you roast a Kenya into how you could taste the same in an Ikawa, when that Kenya arrives at your door and you open the first bag, let's run through a couple 100 grams in the sample roaster. Let's push those boundaries a little bit amongst the ranges of what you knew was good for Kenya, and then you're going to be ready for a production roast sooner. If it's espresso, you're probably going to come down to a few candidates and do that multiple roast evaluation part, and once you've finally selected it, you're probably going to spend even more time on the sample roaster trying different things, especially since you're potentially blending your espresso 1 or 2 additional components. Now you've got a new matrix where you need a bunch of samples that you can trust and rely on to be reproducible in your production roaster. So my tips and tricks side of that would be get that new coffee in, have a sample profile ready to execute what you know you like in that coffee typically for how you're going to use it, and execute it on that sample roaster, evaluate it there, push it out 1 or 2 ways, reevaluate, and decide whether it requires further tuning or pushing. I think you can get all of that done within a day of coffee arriving at your shop in terms of how you're going to use it on the shelf or on the bar. That pretty much winds up my part 3. How am I doing for time? Because I knew we wanted to take this into about 40 minutes. Oh, half an hour in. I'm going to fire up a kettle. I want to pour some coffee. I at least want to talk about it a little bit. I'll probably show you a couple more top-down slides. Where's my turn-on-y? Right there. We're boiling some water. We're going to do a pour-over. Sometimes people ask, when I'm sample roasting, what do you see in terms of reproducibility, or what do you like about the Ikawa? I want to show you a little graph back on this top-down picture. Probably going to hold it up close at some point. This is the coffee I'm going to pour over at the end, and and talk about a little bit more in terms of flavor profile and tastes. This is 2 different sample roasts conducted on that coffee, having calibrated it to our production roast so that we could evaluate changes. I'm going to bring it in a little closer and just point at total bean temperature. There's 2 lines there. We're looking at 2 profiles overlaid. It's almost impossible to see even a bobble between the 2 lines on the total bean temperature. On the yellow and orange, you can see the odd bobble, just a little separation of rate of rise. But you could not ask for better reproducibility of a roast than what that Ikawa is able to do for us. We know that when we dial in a profile, that's what's going to come out of it. It's a beautiful thing to behold. That brings me to waiting for water to boil and potentially opening up a little bit of discussion. I don't know if anyone has a question or would like to hear more information about any of the little concepts I've been touching on. If you did, jump into the chat window.
Dan says, brilliant advice so far. I've always found it difficult to set a benchmark profile on the ProBat 100-gram sample roaster and converting to our ProBat P12. Your insights are brilliant.
Sorry, what was the name? Dan, thank you for that. The Ikawa has made a fundamental difference for us. We've been using it for 4 years now. We've updated to the V3. I've had colleagues and friends on small barrel roasters, notoriously 2 and 4 barrel ProBat roasters seem to be the most common out there. I think those roasters have a great place out in the field at source. You know, you're down in a cupping lab in Central America, and there's Q graders present, and you're going to evaluate 50 coffees, and the day before they're running simultaneous 4 batchers through their little barrel roaster. If you've worked with one, you know how difficult it is to be reproducible on 2 barrels happening at the same time, and you know day to day that running the exact same profile on that ProBat barrel roaster, sample roaster, to reproduce one roast to the next is extremely difficult. I think it can be done. I think with enough data, you'll end up with averages that you can pull, that you can translate those to the P12. Although I don't use the data in the same way, we're roasting on a Diedrich here. I roast in a partnership on a P12. And it is very different from my Diedrich. So I probably need to spend a little bit more on how I translate to that bigger roaster. But this one's where the home is, so that's where I've spent more time. If you have the opportunity to try stuff on the Ikawa, please give it a go. If you want to reach out, I will be throwing an email address up at the end. Reach out, and I'm happy to share which of the Ikawa profiles I tend to start with. I've got tremendous respect for the online library that's been created by Ikawa. We tend to bring down one of those as a start point, and then we've basically put some benchmarks, first start points on 3 or 4 different roasting styles. My standard filter evaluation, which is a little different than our cupping roast, when I know this is going to be a beautiful natural or African coffee, and it's going to be in a pour over. That's my modified Ikawa filter roast profile that I always run to start things with, and then modify from there in terms of finding a potentially better flavor. Couple more questions.
Ingo says, when you compare sample roasting on the Ikawa with the Huki, which one could give you more information for setting up the production roast?
That's a pretty easy one. You don't have to jump through all of the hoops that I'm jumping through with data. I don't even want to show you the spreadsheets. So you export the data from an Ikawa, you export the data from Cropster or Artisan, you regularize and try and transform all the data so that you can put it all into one table and start comparing the math of what's going on. That works, and it's very precise, and it's so repeatable. The Huki will present some challenges in terms of repeatability, and it presents some challenge in terms of sample size. I was never comfortable with the Huki doing less than about 200 grams in terms of how I would translate to a production roast. But when I was doing 300 or 400 grams with a fine enough control on the gas, with a rheostat or a dimmer on the fan speed, I found that I could reliably put together a sample roast, if you will, in the Huki that was time equivalent, total energy input by phase equivalent to what I would be doing in the Diedrich. So hilariously enough, I would actually load backgrounds that I had recorded on the Huki into the software for a production roast and follow them exactly as a start point, having found what I thought tasted good on the Huki. So the Huki can be a wonderful tool. That said, it requires jumping through hoops a little. You know, you're monitoring that roast the whole time. You're pulling off the fan exhaust so you can get some cooling tray fan action going. You're starting with a minimum of maybe 200 grams, so you got to order really big samples, and some people are reticent to send you 12 of their coffees at £1 each. So where it's got a place, I ended up falling away from the Huki as soon as I realized the beauty of the Ikawa, because I can have staff execute roasts based on my instruction. Let's do these 12 coffees following this profile. It's already on the roaster. Hit them. And they can actually be doing other work, or I can be doing other work while that roast happens. You've got to be watching for it to warm up. Once it warms up, it tells you it's ready. You got about 45 seconds to charge the roast. Once you do that, it's going to execute the profile. It's going to cool the coffee down and wait for you to come back and do another one. There's nothing else required. If you got called away once you initiate a batch, you don't even have to think about what's going on in your Ikawa till you remember you have to do another batch. And that efficiency became very important for us as we started getting into more and more coffees over the Huki. Another question, perhaps?
Ivan says, have you ever used the Alio Bullet 1K sample roaster? And what are your thoughts on sample roasts that are up to 1 kilogram? Do you think smaller batch sizes are better for sample roasting?
Yes. No, I'm kidding. I have not used the IO Bullet. Do I think smaller sample sizes are better? Absolutely, because I can get a hold of so many more of them, because I can move through so many more of them fairly quickly. Do I think larger sample roasts have great value? Absolutely. So the Huki or the IO are fundamentally going to be closer to a production roast in the way that they roast. I didn't mention at the beginning, I'm a mechanical engineer, and I spent a fair bit of time in labs designing laboratory experiments and executing them. Started a master's degree where it was all about experimental design. And so I'm kind of into the data of what we're doing with these things. But I'd like you to think about the engineering principles of large versus small. You can't always scale large things down with equivalence. And that's why I'm mentioning that on the smaller batch size, you probably have to execute a faster batch and start looking at total energy input by phase. Once you get up to a more traditional drum style, and maybe the roast is capable of this, I know the Huki was, probably the IO Bullet as well, you're starting to get into better equivalence in terms of the physics of what's happening to the coffee. You're going to see better similarities on color than you will through a sample roaster. One of the things we do not do much of here is color evaluation between sample and production roast. I think once you've done enough batches and played with development time enough, you and I both know, or maybe a few of you know, I can create a coffee which has a darker appearance at a lower drop temp with a longer development time than something that looks dark or that looks lighter that was roasted to a higher temperature. So color is not always the indication of roast level in my world, certainly not reliable between samples and production. I think there's great benefits to both. For ease of translation, larger batches to a production batch, going to be easier. In terms of efficiency, smaller batches will be your friend.
Andrew says, the area under the curve stuff is a new one on me. I'm a soon-to-be roaster on the Alio Bullet. Can I just confirm, with the AUC percentage in each phase, is your experience that equal percentage in FC drop phase is the most critical when translating a profile to production?
I think it is the most critical. I think that development time after first crack is the most critical in terms of where you're going to end up with the nuances in your flavor. That said, Maillard is very, very important. And Maillard is usually where, so between the dry end and the initiation of first crack, the Maillard phase, is usually where we'll start our first experimentations in terms of making changes. I typically know that I want fairly short development times in light, bright African coffees. So that won't be the first thing I'm starting to change. I tend to know what kind of drop temperatures, final roast temperatures I like for those coffees, and that's not going to be the first thing I start to change. I'm going to play with that central section, but I want them to be reasonably equivalent. I think that if the drop temps are equivalent, if the flavor is the same and development time is the same, small variation in the Maillard phase is accountable to the production versus sample size and some of the changes in physics that are going on there. But you've got to taste them once you execute that production roast that's supposed to match that sample. You've got to taste, and figure out whether or not there is a difference in the body, in the reduction of acids, in the production of sugars that happened during the Maillard phase. So that's the first one I'm going to play with in terms of creating the desirable qualities of what I think is endemic to the bean that I'm working with.
Mohammed asks, what parameters should be fixed to compare green beans, but not to use it for production roasting?
The entire roast profile should be fixed. You can probably come up with your own sample roast profile. I would start with one of the ones on the Ikawa site. Reach out after if you want me to talk about what I think are desirable. We're typically into a standard, fairly light roast with a very fixed roast profile that drops all the coffee at the same time. When I was doing it on a Huki, I could execute to within a second or two, to within 1/10 of a degree, the exact same profile across multiple coffees. With the Ikawa, that's almost automatic. I don't think that sampling for evaluation, although you have to be clinically exact in terms of having all the same roasts, just so you're eliminating other variables. You want to roast them all the same way so that you're evaluating them in the same way. All you're doing on a cupping table for evaluation is trying to select good candidates. If you have good candidates based on the potential you see in a cupping bowl, I want you to taste it in different ways. If you're intending a filter coffee and you see good candidates, from a 50-gram sample roast, you'll only have used a portion of it in the cupping bowl. You can go and pour that coffee over. You probably have enough from a 100-gram sample to go try a more traditional filter roast, sample roast, and then evaluate again in the filter. And now you can be extra sure of your selection based on the cupping table. Cupping table is not the way to evaluate what's going to taste good in an espresso machine or in a filter. It's going to allow you to quickly move through a large set of coffees in a reliable, understood, reproducible way that everybody in your team knows how to explore the potential of the coffees that are present. It's not the be-all and end-all of what you're going to do with that coffee.
Ivan says, absolutely fantastic information. And Dwayne and Ivan both agree that a YouTube channel is needed. Is there a way to get a recording of this presentation?
We are recording this presentation. We will post it to our YouTube channel, which I think has one promotional video that someone shot for us about 4 years ago. Now that we've done this first live stream, this is the first time I've ever been on a live stream. It's the first time we set up a bunch of cameras in our room. We're going to start putting out a bunch of tutorial videos. I think a bunch of them are going to be consumer-oriented based on how I think you can make better coffee at home. But I'd also like to get into sort of roaster minute type talks where we get into the finer esoteric parts of some of the roasting, because that's the geeky stuff that I really get excited about. I want people to taste good coffee at home, but at the core of it all is how we roast that stuff. At the very end, we're going to throw up a thanks for coming slide. It says contact@monogram.ca. Reach out there, and we'll add you to a specific list related to this presentation today, where we send out updates to say a video is live now on YouTube, or we've got new videos related to roasting present. I'll create a specific roasting at Monogram type newsletter for you guys, if that would be helpful.
Do you want to do one more, then we go to the pour overs?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I got hot coffee.
Okay. Would you recommend a sample roaster as a learning tool for someone new to coffee roasting? Also, thanks so much for hosting this session. It has been amazing, and I've learned so much.
The way I got started with coffee was with a Huki in my basement. It was installed in a way that to Canadian law would not be to code. Ducted out a basement window, and a big propane tank sitting on the floor to an open burner under a Huki. You know, I kept a carbon monoxide filter and a fire extinguisher. Very handy. But it was really, really a great way to learn what I wanted to see done in the coffee that I was looking for. I ended up with that Huki because I went to a place that I knew always did a wonderful Ethiopian. I called down and said, I'm bringing the family for some Yirgacheffe. Have you got lots? And they said, yeah, come on down. We showed up, and they had run out. They didn't have any on the shelf. They didn't have any for a pour over. And at their table, I started figuring out how I could get a hold of some Yirg and roasting it at home. I think that the more manual controlled, somewhat larger batch enthusiast roasters are the best way to learn roasting. The upshoot or the upside to using one that size is you're producing enough coffee to not have to do it 6 times a day just to keep your family drinking good coffee. You're producing larger batches, and you're going to be able to enjoy it longer, see how it rests. You do 50 grams at a time, you might just really enjoy it and drink it all. You'll never figure out what happens to it a week after roast. A sample roaster is more of an efficiency tool. A small sample style is an efficiency tool for making sure we have reproducible results when we're evaluating and when we're trying to find that optimal roast for the production roast. It's great for that once you already understand how you're roasting. I suspect my water's hot, yeah? Does it hold temp? All right. I'm going to do a little pour over. I'm welcoming more questions. We are on no fixed timeline here, so feel free to keep chatting while I pour a little bit of Honduras. I might throw the bag under the zoomy thing too. This is a beautiful little coffee. I chose it for the data analysis just because of how complex it was, and because of that complexity, it was a better indicator for us on when we had reached an equilibration between sample and production roast that I thought would be meaningful. The Marcala group in Honduras brings together the efforts from a few generational family farms. This is a pretty interesting coffee. I don't think I'll be able to zoom in on the label, but check out the amount of varietals involved right there. We've got Marcala Typica, Bourbon, Catuai, Pacas, Margohipe, Limpira, and an IH Cafe 90 from 4 different farms, all of which have been natural processed and brought back together. So it's got depth, it's got sweetness. We called it First Kiss because if you're somewhat familiar with the trends in the 90s, Hubba Bubba watermelon gum was coming out. There was watermelon lip gloss. This coffee, when you get your nose over the cup, gives you a beautiful candy aroma. And then in the cup, we get watermelon notes. And that's something that is pretty uncommon in most of the coffees I've tried. Yes, I've got a Yirgacheffe love for blueberry notes, and we're always trying to find one of those. But to see something natural processed out of Central America where we're getting watermelon notes, just really cool. I get some scales. Also, still a good time for questions, because I'm just going to make coffee and then drink some. I will talk about coffee all day long, given the opportunity. Nobody else has questions?
Not at the moment.
They want to see whether or not Graham can still execute dual pour-overs? We'll try. Oh, we've got him there. So Diedrich on my right hand.
In the red one?
Yeah. I guess we're going to find out whether or not we still have a bloom, because we roasted this a little bit in advance of our talk here, because we're all nervous about doing our first Zoom broadcast. Oh, I waited too long over there.
We got 2 questions.
Go ahead.
Ingo, are you working with the area under the curve in production roasting, and are you using a particular software to track it in live?
We are not working with area under the curve as we execute a production roast. We're currently just hooked up to Artisan on our Diedrich. You can view it, but at the end of the day, truly comparing area under the curve roast to roast and against a potential sample roast difference is a bit of a math exercise and a little bit of an analysis that you probably don't want to do. I want you to think about area under the curve for the production roast, and when you get the one that you think was the best production roast, extract that data and start looking at it. How many grams did I have here?
21, you're doing 340.
Cool. And then go back to your sample roaster and look at how that equates to a roast that would have similar areas under the curve and give you the ability to experiment with changing things. I don't think you need to use area under the curve to reproduce what your beautiful production roast, your favorite roast, ended up being.
Take one more?
Sure.
Dan asks, what's your difference in washed and natural coffee sample roasting?
It depends on the coffee a little bit. When I'm doing it for evaluation, big cupping table full of candidates, then I'm still just doing a standard cupping roast, our standard cupping roast. I really try and make sure that when we're evaluating naturals, we do it at a different time or on a different day than when we're evaluating washed coffees. There's a halo effect to what happens with natural coffees, the amount of sweetness, the amount of vibrancy. They can blow the other coffees off the table. You could get the sweetest, most beautiful Central American washed coffee that has, cherry notes and brightness and great acidity and clarity. And then you have a natural Ethiopia on the table, and it just makes it pale in comparison. So always keep them separate. In terms of what I would do after that, I do have differences. So I have what I would call starting point samples for equivalents in the production roaster that are different for a washed Kenya than they are for an heirloom natural Ethiopian. How are they different? Typically just a little bit more development time on the natural coffees. typically a slightly higher drop temperature than I would have with a Kenya, for example. That's just rule of thumbish type talk, but no hard and fast rule. You got to taste, and figure out your own. Does that help? No follow-up question?
We have another one from Andrew.
All right. I'm going to be drinking coffee while I talk about the next one.
Okay.
And I've got 2 wonderful production assistants, and if they would like some coffee, they'll get some.
Andrew asks, awesome information, and that coffee sounds insane. Slightly off topic, but how do you approach QC?
Well, we've done it in various ways, and I think I'm in the midst of trying to change how we're doing it. Our QC is currently to pull a small sample out of the cooling tray once the coffee's cooled down. Got these wonderful little things on Alibaba at one point. It's really fun because they exactly fit into the Ikawa, so it'll hold 50 grams of green, it'll hold 50 grams of roasted coffee. So we scoop one of these in, we mark the batch on it. When we're doing multiple batches of the same coffee, yep, we're pulling some of each of those. We used to do a cupping of those coffees by putting them on a cupping table in what I consider to be an evaluation style cupping. We gained some insight there. We would typically, look at coffees from the last week on a Monday morning, put them into a coarse grind, into a cupping bowl, and go around slurping them all, and understand what we liked or didn't like different about how they tasted on the cupping table. That sometimes informed us. If we said, oh, this one, I loved the brightness in this one compared to that bowl beside it from the other roast. Let's look at the profile and see what was different. Sometimes that brightness and clarity was an identifiable part of the production roast that we could move towards. That said, the differences aren't the same as what you'll see in its final use application. I don't think that an espresso roast of the base component of an espresso on the cupping table being evaluated under that very different roast style and even against a Kenya on the cupping table, which is a radically different style of roast than what you're doing in an evaluation sample cupping. That tells you about how people are going to taste it when they get a hold of it. All of this is going to change based on the method of preparation. So what we're going to be moving to is taking our samples that have been pulled. Just bear with me. We're good. Doing more of exactly what you've seen here today, but on a larger scale. So if I've got a production roast where I've executed 20 batches of one coffee that I know is going to be used for filter, I don't have to pull 20 samples of that. I need to pull a sample whenever there's slight differences in the profile that I want to evaluate. And then I want to rest that coffee, perhaps a week, and then I want to do pour-overs of it, or pull espresso shots with the coffee if it was intended for espresso, and evaluate it there in its intended use. I want to do that with my roasting staff, with my manager of education and coffee quality. I want to do it with my head baristas present. I want everybody to understand what we're shooting for when we change a coffee, when we're evaluating it, what we think is better and why. I want that transparency and openness around the communication of what's happening, but I think there's more value in end-use testing of the coffee than getting it back on a cupping table.
How long are you letting the samples rest before cupping them? And by the way, thanks for this great webinar and all the valuable information.
Thank you guys for attending. As I said, it's our first one ever. Kind of interesting that Global Coffee Festival on its first endeavor had to go quite so virtual. We're glad to have been a part of it. We typically, if we're scheduling a sample roast for cupping evaluation, we're generally doing the roast on Friday and evaluating on Monday. So I like to see 2 to 3 days after a roast. When you're at source and in a cupping lab, you're probably looking at coffee that was roasted a minimum of 24 hours ago. I think that's okay. With a lot of the Central American and sometimes even with natural processed things, there's a dead spot to me in the coffee in that 24 to 36, 48 hours. I think that coffee straight out of the cooling tray is more representative of what you're doing. So sample roasting for evaluation and cupping it right that day, that afternoon, is probably better than waiting 24 hours, in my opinion. If you have the time to wait 72 hours, I think it's better.
Dwayne, thank you so much for your insights, Graham. Miss all of you.
Dwayne, I look forward to tasting coffee when you get roasting in Sudbury. We're going to throw up a thanks for coming out type slide. It's got our email address there. Of course, that represents our website. If you want to sign up for other newsletters too, feel free. This is not an advertorial. Just reach out if you want to follow up and communicate about what's cool about roasting. I'm always open for that discussion. If you have ideas about what you'd like to see us do in a video in the future, absolutely, love to hear it. We'll throw that up. We'll leave it open for another 10 minutes. If we see a question come into the chat, I'll jump back up here and we'll talk to it. Meanwhile, I'm going to enjoy a couple of cups of coffee. Thank you, everybody, for attending today.